February 19, 1944. Dawn breaks over the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. The sky is bruised purple and gray, streaked with the first light of morning. The air smells of sulfur and salt, carried on winds that whisper across a landscape alien and unforgiving. On the northern ridges, Captain Takichi Nishi of the Imperial Japanese Army Tank Corps stands beside the twisted wreckage of what was once a Type 97 Chiha medium tank. Its armor is peeled open like the skin of overripe fruit, the turret blown 15 meters from the chassis. He does not speak. Around him, junior officers wade in the half-light, their faces drawn tight with something that goes beyond exhaustion. In the distance, beyond the ash and the smoke that never fully clears, the Pacific Ocean stretches infinite and indifferent. And on that ocean, barely visible through the morning haze, the shapes of American warships sit like iron mountains that have learned to float. Nishi places his hand against the torn metal of the tank. It is still warm. He knows what did this. He has seen it 3 times now in the past 4 days. The pattern is always the same. First comes the thunder from the sea, not the crack of rifles or the percussion of mortars, but something older and more terrible, the sound of gods hurling mountains. Then, as the earth itself seems to liquefy beneath the shelling, the American M4 Sherman tanks emerge through the smoke, moving not as individual hunters, but as a single coordinated organism. They advance in formation, covering one another's flanks, communicating through means Nishi cannot intercept. And when Japanese positions attempt to respond, when brave men crawl from caves with satchel charges or attempt to maneuver the few remaining Type 97s into ambush positions, the naval guns find them, not through luck, not through coincidence, through precision that suggests the tanks and the ships are speaking to each other, sharing eyes and intentions across kilometers of smoke and chaos. This is not how war was supposed to be fought. To understand the terror that seized Japanese officers when they first witnessed coordinated Sherman naval gunfire operations, one must first understand the doctrine they had been taught, the victories they had celebrated, and the enemy they believed they were fighting. Throughout the 1930s and into the early Pacific campaigns of 1942, Japanese armor doctrine had been built around the concept of infantry support and exploitation of disorganized enemy positions. The Type 97 Chiha, Japan's most common medium tank, was designed to face Chinese forces poorly equipped with anti-armor weapons, to cross rough terrain in support of aggressive infantry advances, and to serve as mobile pillboxes when defensive positions required reinforcement. Its 57mm gun was adequate against thin-skinned vehicles and fortifications. Its armor, rarely exceeding 25mm, was sufficient when the enemy possessed few dedicated anti-tank weapons. Japanese tank officers trained in the art of rapid flanking maneuvers, night attacks, and close coordination with infantry units who shared their language, their training, and their willingness to die for the emperor. And this doctrine had proven effective in Manchuria, in China, in the early Philippines campaign. Japanese armor had crushed under-equipped Chinese divisions, had overwhelmed American and Filipino defenders on Bataan who lacked adequate anti-tank guns, and had supported infantry advances through Malaya and Burma with brutal efficiency. By mid-1942, officers like Captain Nishi, an Olympic equestrian who had trained with cavalry units before transitioning to armor, had come to believe in a particular narrative. The Japanese fighting spirit, tactical aggressiveness, and willingness to sacrifice would overcome American material advantages. The Americans, they were told, were soft, individualistic, obsessed with personal survival. Their soldiers would break when faced with determined assault. Their armor would scatter when confronted by men willing to die to destroy it. The early American tanks seemed to confirm this assessment. The M3 Stuart light tanks encountered at Guadalcanal were fast but lightly armored, vulnerable to 47mm anti-tank guns and even to determined infantry assault. The M3 Lee medium tanks, with their awkward sponson-mounted 75mm guns, were mechanically unreliable in jungle conditions and tactically inflexible. Japanese after-action reports from 1942 and early 1943 described American armor as mechanically sophisticated but operationally timid, noting that American tank crews seemed unwilling to press attacks when faced with determined resistance, that they withdrew to regroup rather than accepting casualties to achieve breakthrough. But by late 1943, something had changed. The M4 Sherman had arrived in the Pacific in significant numbers, and with it came something that Japanese intelligence officers struggled to quantify in their reports: a new operational doctrine that married American industrial capacity to a coordination system that rendered traditional Japanese anti-armor tactics obsolete. The Sherman itself was not on paper a revolutionary design. Its 74mm M3 gun was effective but not exceptional. Its armor, 38mm to 76mm depending on facing and variant, was proof against small arms and shell fragments, but vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank guns of 47mm or larger. Its gasoline engine was prone to fires when penetrated, earning it the grim nickname Ronson among some crews, after the cigarette lighter that lights first time, every time. German tank officers on the European front had learned to exploit the Sherman's weaknesses, using superior Tiger and Panther guns to engage at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm was ineffective. But the Sherman possessed qualities that were invisible in specification sheets and incomprehensible to an enemy that had never witnessed American industrial organization. The United States produced over 49,000 Shermans between 1942 and 1945, more tanks than Germany and Japan combined produced during the entire war. This staggering output meant that American commanders could contemplate tactical approaches that would be suicidal for forces with limited armor reserves. A Sherman knocked out could be replaced within days. Crews could be rotated, rested, given time to integrate lessons learned. Maintenance systems could be standardized across the entire Pacific theater, with spare parts manufactured in Detroit arriving in Saipan or Guam within weeks of requisition. More importantly, every Sherman was equipped with radio communication systems that Japanese armor could not match. While Type 97 Chiha tanks relied on flag signals or physical messengers to coordinate during combat, methods that became useless once smoke and chaos enveloped the battlefield. Sherman crews communicated constantly through SCR 528 radio sets. Tank commanders could speak directly to their platoon leaders. Company commanders could coordinate entire formations in real time, and forward observers could call for artillery or air support while maintaining their position in the armored advance. But even this advantage paled compared to what happened when the United States Navy entered the equation. The first coordinated Sherman naval gunfire operation in the Pacific Theater occurred during the assault on Tarawa Atoll in November 1943. The technique was experimental, improvised under desperate circumstances. American Marines had landed on Batio Island expecting naval bombardment to have neutralized Japanese defensive positions. Instead, they found a network of reinforced bunkers and pillboxes largely intact, with interlocking fields of fire that turned the beaches into killing grounds. As Marines died by the hundreds in the surf, unable to advance against fortifications their individual weapons could not scratch, Sherman tanks of the 2nd Tank Battalion attempted to push inland from the beachhead. The Shermans faced a nightmare scenario. Japanese defenders had pre-sighted every avenue of approach, had positioned Type 97 tanks and 47mm anti-tank guns in camouflaged positions, and had prepared suicide teams armed with magnetic mines and satchel charges to swarm any armor that penetrated the coastal defenses. The first 2 Shermans to push inland were destroyed within minutes, one by a mine that severed its track, the second by a 47 Fekubieter round that penetrated its side armor and ignited ammunition. But then a Marine Corps forward observer attached to the tank company did something that had never been formally trained, never been written into doctrine manuals. Using his radio, he contacted the Fire Direction Center aboard the USS Maryland, a battleship positioned 8 kilometers offshore. He provided coordinates for a Japanese strongpoint that was stalling the armor advance. He requested naval gunfire support, not in the general area, not preparatory bombardment, but precision fire directed by someone watching the battlefield from a Sherman's perspective. The Maryland's 16-inch guns spoke 3 minutes later. Each shell weighed over a ton. They arrived not in a scattered pattern but in a focused salvo that obliterated 2 reinforced concrete pillboxes and created a breach in the Japanese defensive line. The Shermans advanced through the gap, and the forward observer called corrections, walking naval gunfire ahead of the armored advance like a farmer burning rows of field stubble. Japanese defenders attempting to reposition anti-tank guns found themselves targeted by shells that arrived with such precision that survivors spoke of American shells following them as they retreated. The coordination was crude by later standards. The communication chain was improvised, the timing uncertain, the accuracy dependent on the Maryland's experienced gunnery officers making educated guesses about shell trajectories. But it worked. The Shermans reached their objectives. The Marines broke through fortifications that might have held for days. And across the Pacific, in operations rooms aboard fleet carriers and on planning tables in Pearl Harbor, American commanders recognized that they had stumbled onto something that could change the character of amphibious warfare. By February 1944, when Captain Nishi stood beside the destroyed Chiha on Iwo Jima's volcanic slopes, the coordination had evolved from improvisation into systematic doctrine. Naval gunfire liaison officers were now embedded with every tank company expected to operate within range of naval support. They carried radio equipment that could communicate directly with fire direction centers aboard battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They trained with tank crews, learning to read terrain from an armor perspective, understanding sight lines and defilade positions. Forward observers learned naval terminology. Battleship crews learned to respond to land warfare requirements with the same precision they applied to anti-aircraft fire or counter-battery operations against enemy ships. The effect on the battlefield was multiplicative, not additive. A Sherman company advancing alone could be stopped by prepared defensive positions, channeled into kill zones, forced to withdraw when casualties mounted. But a Sherman company coordinating with naval gunfire became something altogether different, a hybrid entity that combined the mobility and survivability of armor with the crushing firepower of naval artillery. Japanese defenders would see the Shermans approaching, would prepare their anti-tank guns and suicide teams, would wait for the Americans to enter effective range. Then the horizon would flash and the world would end. 14-inch shells from the USS Pennsylvania, 16-inch shells from the USS Tennessee, each one capable of collapsing a reinforced bunker, of obliterating an entire defensive position, of creating craters 6 meters deep and 20 meters across. The shells arrived with such precision that Sherman crews learned to advance within 50 meters of the impact zone, close enough to feel the concussion through their armor, knowing that Japanese defenders would be too stunned to respond effectively in the seconds after impact. When anti-tank guns did manage to engage, when Japanese crews showed the suicidal courage required to maintain their positions through naval bombardment and open fire on advancing Shermans, the American response was overwhelming and immediate. Forward observers would mark the position, transmit coordinates, and naval guns would bracket the target with ranging shots before delivering shells that left nothing but twisted metal and pulverized earth. The entire sequence, from anti-tank gun firing to its obliteration, could take less than 90 seconds. Japanese tank officers like Captain Nishi were trained warriors who had faced death in China, who had studied armored warfare theory, who understood combined arms tactics. But nothing in their training, nothing in their experience had prepared them for an enemy that could bring battleship guns to a tank fight. The psychological impact was profound and debilitating. Traditional anti-armor tactics required defenders to hold position, to wait for the enemy to enter effective range, to accept casualties while delivering precise fire against vulnerable points. But how could defenders hold position when the ground itself was being excavated by shells weighing more than entire Type 97 tanks? How could gunners maintain accuracy when concussion waves from distant impacts were rupturing eardrums, when volcanic dust kicked up by near misses was blinding observation posts, when the very earth was trembling like water? After-action reports recovered from Japanese positions tell stories of disintegration, not just of defensive lines, but of tactical coherence itself. Officers described situations where orders could not be transmitted because messengers were killed by shell fragments before reaching their destinations, where defensive positions prepared over months were obliterated in minutes, where Type 97 tanks attempting to maneuver into ambush positions were targeted by naval guns before they could fire a single shot. Some reports speak plainly of terror, officers using the word kyofu, a fear that goes beyond danger into existential horror. The recognition that the enemy possessed the capabilities so overwhelming that courage and training became irrelevant. One particularly detailed report, filed by a Major Iwo Yamada after the fall of Saipan in July 1944, describes watching a coordinated Sherman naval attack from an observation post on Mount Tapocho. He writes of seeing 8 Sherman tanks advancing across the Central Valley, moving in formation with intervals precise as parade ground drill. Japanese artillery opened fire, scoring at least 2 hits that he could observe through binoculars. The Shermans halted, reversed into defilade positions behind a low ridge. Yamada notes that his artillery officers believed they had achieved a defensive success, that the American armor had been stopped. Then, in Yamada's words, "The sea came to kill us." The battleship USS California and the cruiser USS Louisville opened fire in a rolling barrage that walked across the Japanese artillery positions. Yamada describes shells arriving like a line drawn by a giant's brush, each impact creating eruptions of earth and flame, the line advancing steadily toward his own observation post. He estimates the barrage lasted 7 minutes. When it ceased, the Japanese artillery positions had been obliterated, every gun destroyed or buried, crews dead or so severely concussed they could not stand. And then the Shermans emerged from defilade and continued their advance, unopposed, moving across ground that minutes before had bristled with defensive firepower. Yamada concludes his report with a sentence that has been quoted in multiple histories of the Pacific War. "We were not defeated by tanks, but by the ocean-made weapon." The terror Japanese officers experienced was not merely fear of death. Soldiers expect death, but the horror of tactical obsolescence. Every doctrine they had learned, every victory they had celebrated was predicated on certain assumptions about how war functioned. Armor fought armor. Artillery supported infantry. Naval guns were strategic weapons, too imprecise and too valuable to waste on tactical support of ground operations. An aggressive defense with prepared positions camouflaged anti-armor weapons, and soldiers willing to sacrifice themselves could stop or at least delay armored advances long enough for reinforcements to arrive or counterattacks to be organized. The Americans had rewritten these rules, they had created a system where armor did not fight alone, where artillery support could arrive from ships 20 kilometers offshore with precision that rivaled direct-fire weapons, where the distinction between strategic and tactical assets had dissolved into a unified operational approach that brought every available resource to bear at the point of decision. Japanese defenders were not facing Sherman tanks. They were facing the entire industrial and organizational capacity of the United States, compressed into a single coordinated weapon system. And the symbol of this new reality, the object that appeared in after-action reports and soldier diaries with almost obsessive frequency, was the radio antenna. Japanese soldiers reported seeing the antennae on Sherman tanks, long whip antennas that marked command vehicles, the shorter antennas that every tank carried. They reported seeing American soldiers with radio packs, forward observers with equipment that seemed disproportionately sophisticated for their role. In prisoner interrogations after the war, multiple Japanese officers mentioned the antennas as the thing that first made them realize they were losing, that their forces could not compete. The antennas represented something more fundamental than tactical communication. They represented an enemy that could coordinate across kilometers, across service branches, across the boundary between land and sea, with a speed and precision that rendered traditional concepts of battlefield friction irrelevant. One captured Japanese tank officer, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, told his interrogators about an incident on Peleliu in September 1944. His Type 97 tank had survived the initial landings, had taken up a position in a cave complex prepared for anti-armor defense. When Shermans approached, he maneuvered to engage from the flank, achieving what should have been an ideal tactical position. He fired 3 rounds, scoring 2 hits on a Sherman that stopped but did not catch fire. He was preparing to fire again when naval shells began to impact around his position. He had been spotted not by the Sherman he was engaging, but by another tank 300 meters away, and that tank had called down naval gunfire with such precision that the 3rd shell collapsed the cave entrance, trapping his crew inside. They survived, dug themselves out over 3 days, and surrendered when American infantry finally cleared the cave complex. Sakai told his interrogators that the moment that broke his spirit was not being trapped, not the surrender, but watching through a crack in the rubble as more Shermans advanced past his position, each one with its antenna marking it as part of a network he could neither see nor disrupt. "We were fighting alone," he said through the translator. They were never alone. By late 1944 and into 1945, as American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, coordinated Sherman naval gunfire operations had achieved a degree of sophistication that would seem fantastic if not documented in meticulous operational records. During the Iwo Jima campaign in February and March 1945, naval gunfire liaison teams aboard Shermans could request and receive fire support from multiple ships simultaneously, creating box barrages that sealed off Japanese counterattack routes or walking barrages that preceded armor advances like rolling walls of steel and high explosive. Fire direction centers aboard ships maintained detailed maps of the island marked with constantly updated friendly positions, allowing them to deliver fire within 100 meters of American forces, a danger-close distance that would have been unthinkable in 1943. The precision improved throughout the campaign. By the 3rd week of fighting on Iwo Jima, naval gunners had become so familiar with the island's terrain that forward observers could request fire on pre-designated targets using simple alphanumeric codes. A Sherman company encountering a strong point could radio Target Hotel 7, fire for effect, and within 2 minutes shells would be impacting a cave complex that had been mapped, sighted, and pre-calculated for trajectory and charge. Japanese defenders who survived these attacks reported that resistance seemed futile, that every position, no matter how well concealed, would eventually be located and obliterated, that the Americans possessed an intelligence capability that verged on supernatural. The reality was more mundane, but more terrifying. Systematic application of industrial-scale resources to tactical problems. The United States Navy had assigned entire ships to ground support missions. The battleship USS Idaho spent 37 consecutive days off Okinawa in spring 1945, providing fire support for Army and Marine Corps operations, firing over 2,400 rounds from its main batteries and countless thousands of rounds from secondary armament. Fire direction teams developed such familiarity with frontline conditions that they could anticipate requests, pre-position ships for optimal firing angles, calculate munitions requirements for extended operations. The Navy was not supporting Army and Marine Corps armor operations as a favor or a temporary expedient. They were integrated components of a single operational system. Japanese officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs in the decades after consistently described the psychological impact of this integration as more devastating than the physical destruction. Major General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding officer of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, wrote in a letter to his wife in January 1945, weeks before the American invasion, that his greatest fear was not American infantry or armor, but the coordination he had witnessed during the Marianas Campaign. The Americans, he wrote, have learned to make the ocean their artillery park, and our guns cannot reach far enough to silence theirs. We are fighting an enemy who brings the resources of a continent to small islands, while we defend with what we carried. The terror was not merely tactical, but philosophical, a recognition that the war had been lost not on battlefields, but in factories, shipyards, and training centers thousands of miles from the fighting. Every Sherman tank represented not just a vehicle, but an entire supply chain. The steel mills in Gary, Indiana, the engine plants in Detroit, the optical equipment manufactured in Rochester, New York, the radio components from a dozen different suppliers. The training programs that produced crews faster than combat could consume them. The Liberty ships that carried tanks across the Pacific in climate-controlled holds. The port facilities that could unload, maintain, and deploy armor with industrial efficiency. And every naval shell represented a similar web of capability. The shipyards that built battleships, the mines that produced steel and explosive, the fire control systems developed by civilian engineers, the institutional knowledge of a navy that had been projecting power across oceans for generations. Japanese officers had been taught that spirit could overcome material, that the warrior ethos of Bushido would prove superior to American softness and mechanical dependence. But on the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, in the caves of Peleliu, across the killing grounds of Saipan and Okinawa, they discovered a different truth. American forces were not soft, they were systematic. They did not lack fighting spirit. They had institutionalized the lessons of warfare into doctrines that could be taught, practiced, and executed with devastating consistency. The Sherman tanks advancing with naval gunfire support were not evidence of American material advantage overcoming Japanese courage. They were evidence that the United States had industrialized warfare itself, had transformed combat from a contest of warriors into a problem of logistics, communication, and coordinated application of force. And there was no answer to this in Japanese doctrine, no counter-tactic that could overcome the fundamental asymmetry. Japanese forces could not outproduce American factories. They could not match the radio networks that coordinated American operations. They could not sink the battleships that provided fire support from beyond the range of coastal guns. Every defensive success was temporary, every tactical victory meaningless, because the Americans would return with more tanks, more shells, more coordination, grinding forward with the inevitability of industrial processes. Captain Nishi never left Iwo Jima. He died sometime in late March 1945, the exact circumstances lost in the chaos of the battle's final days. Some accounts suggest he was killed by naval gunfire while attempting to organize a final counterattack. Others claim he committed suicide after his tank was destroyed. The truth is probably more mundane, that he died as thousands of Japanese soldiers died on that island, in fire and smoke and the thunder of shells that arrived from ships he could not see. But in the wreckage of his last tank, American troops found papers, operational notes, observations, fragments of reports. Among them was a single sentence written in precise military Japanese, dated February 27, 1945. The American tanks have learned to carry the sea with them, and we are drowning on dry land. It is the poetry of the defeated, the recognition that this war had ceased to be a conflict between armies and had become something else. A demonstration of what happens when industrial civilization turns its full attention to the problem of coordinated violence. The Sherman tanks themselves were not revolutionary. The naval guns had existed for decades. Radio communication was understood technology. But their integration, their systematic application to tactical problems with institutional support and limitless material backing, created something that pre-industrial military traditions could not counter. The ocean, which Japanese strategists had once believed would be their defensive bulwark, their moat protecting the sacred home islands, had instead become a weapon in American hands. It had become not a barrier, but a highway for force projection, a platform for firepower, a communications medium through which coordination could be achieved across distances that rendered traditional command structures obsolete. And the Shermans, those mass-produced symbols of American industrial capacity, had become the means by which naval power was projected inland, transformed from strategic asset into tactical instrument. Japanese officers were terrified not because they faced death. Every soldier expects that. But because they faced obsolescence, because their training, their doctrine, their entire conception of warfare had been rendered irrelevant by an enemy that fought not with superior courage, but with superior systems. The terror was the recognition that this enemy could not be stopped by determination alone, that the war had been lost before the first shot was fired, decided in factory output tables and logistics planning sessions rather than on battlefields. And in that terror was a glimpse of the future of warfare, not a future of heroes and decisive battles, but of coordination and systematic application of resources, where victory belongs not to the most courageous but to the most organized, where the ocean itself can become artillery, and the radio antenna marks the line between victory and annihilation.